our keynotes for today, and we've got Cisco's coming up after me. We've got HTC coming up this afternoon. We've got Google at the end of the day, and then there's me. And so some of you are probably asking yourselves the same question that I've been asking myself for the past week and a half or so. In your heads, it probably sounds a little like, what the bloody hell is he doing delivering a keynote? I was originally scheduled to deliver Traceview and Matt for fun and profit. But Kevin sent me an email saying, how would you like to deliver the opening keynote? I was stunned. I was honored. I was speechless. Literally. I said, yeah, Traceview and Matt, nice topic. Not really keynote material. So I shot Kevin some suggestions, and he picked out of the list of possible topics, predictions sure to go wrong. The sure to go wrong part, if you're wondering why, think about my last name for a little bit. The predictions are because, if you think about it, it's been 3 years, almost to the day, from when the original Android device, in the States known as the T-Mobile G1, here's the HTC Dream, shipped, and the Android era began. There'd been no way we'd have predicted in 2008 where we would be today. If we could hijack a TARDIS, go back to talk to our 2008 selves and tell them, yeah, we'd have 300 plus devices out there. Depending on whose survey you're reading, and that Android be the #1 mobile operating system. We'd have conferences, we'll have squishable mascots, and the like. Most of your 2008 selves would have been giddy, bursting with joy. The rest of your 2008 selves would think that your 2011 selves, I believe the local term here is nutter, and that there'd been no way that they'd have believed it. And Kevin thought that this would make for a fine presentation, because he asked for something, quote, a little more lighthearted and community-orientated than Traceview and Matt. Ignoring for the moment that I'm not sure orientated is a word, the lighthearted, and I was like, lighthearted? I was thinking about, painting doom and gloom and, scaring the whole lot of you, and that, but, in the spirit of cooperation between our two fine nations, I decided to go with a mostly lighthearted predictions sure to go wrong. It's mostly lighthearted, Can't have it all be unicorns and rainbows. Somebody will be expecting me to be cleaning out the unicorn stables, and I ain't doing it. So without further ado, 5 predictions sure to go wrong. Prediction number 1. In 3 years' time, 1 out of every 3 new mobile apps created will be written using cross-platform tools. Here, by cross-platform, I mean write once, run on multiple mobile operating systems. Maybe the tools will let you get to other environments, the web, desktop, whatever. That's not really the focus here. Now, what are these tools? Well, there's probably going to be some that will crop up over these 3 years that we won't have foreseen. After all, nobody would necessarily have foreseen some of the ones that we have up here. Right now, a lot of the focus is on web-centric tools for cross-platform stuff, whether you're creating just a pure HTML5 app or you're using other wrappers around it to help make more of that native app that you're building with web technologies. Personally, I'm predicting that the winner in this space would be PhoneGap. For those of you who didn't hear the announcement, Adobe acquired Nitobi, the firm behind PhoneGap. PhoneGap's being contributed to the Apache Software Foundation. And so these sorts of tools, those, roads, and so on, and that are likely candidates for a lot of these applications. You're going to have a new wave of app generators cropping up over the next 3 years. We've seen so far generators that, sometimes are a little on the weak side, hey, take your web content and we'll automatically create an Android app for you, type stuff. But there's a lot of room for growth for allowing people to basically be able to provide high-level specifications and get an app meeting those specifications out for them where they're not worrying about slinging Java code and so on. Flash, Mono, Unity 3D, Titanium Mobile, the list goes on and on of all of the different possible tools here. Part of the reason they're going to do that is to try to reach that broadest possible market. Right now, if you are going to be thinking about smartphones, you're going to be thinking iOS and Android. But I'm not counting out Windows Phone, sorry. I am counting out Windows Mobile. And that Windows Phone, I mean, you know, Microsoft plus Nokia, and that, it'd be really hard for them to screw that up too bad. And that it is a very good chance that they're going to be able to carve out, in 3 years' time, a decent-sized chunk of the market. And so now, if you're talking getting into 3 platforms, let alone anything else that might transpire between now and then, cross-platform tools, I mean, are going to look really interesting. Sometimes there'll be other things they're trying to get away from. You know, Financial Times is, you know, elected to get rid of their iOS native app, go strictly to an HTML5 app to get away from the 30% cut that Apple wants of all the Financial Times subscriptions that come in through their app. Maybe some of these tools would just be interesting on their own merits to people, and the fact that it happens to wind up being cross-platform is more of a side benefit. But these tools are going to become increasingly important over these next few years. And so, in addition to all of the lovely native coding that we're doing now, you want to keep in mind that, hey, watch the trend lines, and you may want to think about adding one or more of these other technologies to your arsenal when it makes sense. Prediction number 2. By the end of this presentation, tablets will make netbooks irrelevant, with e-readers to follow by 2014. Technically, that's a little aggressive. Netbooks have like 15 more minutes, and that to try to stage a comeback, and that I'm not holding out a ton of hope for them. The netbooks, that's not a huge shock of a prediction. I mean, this audience here uses netbooks way more than the majority of the populace. And that netbooks never really caught on all that much. And therefore, you know, the need for the netbook never really set up. And for a lot of people, combination of a tablet and some sort of a keyboard will form a perfectly functional replacement for the netbook form factor. E-readers may seem a little bit more of a stretch. After all, Amazon, you know, the king of e-readers, in addition to the Kindle Fire, announced 3 new ordinary e-ink Kindles. It would seem odd for me to be predicting that those are going to somehow go away here in just 3 years' time. The reason isn't so much that they're going away, is that they're going to be absorbed. Right now, particularly with the introduction of the Kindle Fire, e-readers pretty much are now the niche of e-ink display single-purpose devices, that they're there only for the purposes of reading some sort of an e-book. Well, you know, if we get into better forms of e-ink displays, you know, like the technology coming out of Pixel QI or Pixel Key or Hint, if you're forming a company, pick a name that's pronounceable by keynote speakers. I'd really appreciate it. But you know, technology like that, where you can actually push frame rates that are acceptable for playing Fruit Ninja and the kin, and that now we're getting to the point of, okay, well, maybe tablets are going to switch to e-ink en masse, assuming the price points are there. And so then we're now looking at not so much that e-readers go away, as they're just absorbed, and it's simply a spectrum of price points for tablets. There's cheap tablets, medium tablets, expensive tablets, diamond-encrusted tablets. The same sort of thing has happened before. There used to be dedicated equipment known as word processors, that it was hardware. It was about the size at the top of this podium, and that all it would do was word processing. This was, you know, 25, 30 years ago, and that I had hair then, but they went away. They were replaced by the more general purpose units that could do word processing and play Zork and similar sorts of things. So the same thing will happen with e-readers, is that the need for e-readers isn't going to go away. E-readers will simply be absorbed by a new generation of tablets with better display technology. Continuing on the theme, prediction number 3, in 3 years' time, Amazon will be the number 2 consumer tablet manufacturer. Not everybody's going to be happy with this prediction. Tim Bray, if he finds out about I made this prediction, will probably tweet something to the effect of, we shouldn't be making predictions about the Kindle Fire since nobody's really worked with it much yet. One of our sponsors at this presentation isn't going to be too happy about this either, and that I'm sorry, and that the key here, though, is consumer, and that I do not think Amazon's going to make a dent in the enterprise, but from a consumer standpoint, and that I think Amazon is going to wind up having a winner, even if the Kindle Fire turns out to not on its own be a runaway hit, the way some people are predicting. After all, that first generation Kindle wasn't an awesome piece of tech. It was okay, it worked well, but you look at the second and third generation Kindles, they were much smoother hardware and software. That first generation Kindle was priced at $399 US, and it sold more than some of the Android tablets that have been out this year. Part of the problem is that tablets are new. There is no pre-established hole in the heads of consumers that a tablet is supposed to plug into. They need some sort of a story. So for existing technology, they know how to use it. They know why they might want one of these things. So when mobile phones first came out, and for some of you, yes, there was a time before we actually had phones that we could carry around with us. Remember the hair? And that when they first came out, it took a while for the adoption to pick up, but that was relatively easy because people knew about phones. They just hadn't had the notion about phones that they could carry with them. Totally new segments, though, they don't know why. They don't know why they should think about it, why they should care. They need a story. They need a reason why they should care about the target, the product segment, let alone the products themselves. The firms who come up with the unique, credible stories for the segment will be the ones who will be driving adoption of the actual product in that segment. Where the easiest story is you're finding some way to extend an existing brand in an existing established segment in order to try to bridge that into a new product segment. You can draw, comparison in automotive and related technologies. The Toyota Prius. Yes, radically different stuff under the hood. It's a car. People know how to use cars. Mostly. And that. They know why they might need a car, they know what they need in a car, feature function, that sort of stuff they can make comparisons on. The Segway, nobody could figure out what to do with the darn thing. And so, therefore, Segway itself wasn't able to convince the public that they needed one of those things, and therefore, it never really caught on. So when you think about tablets, the iPad, the story is, it's mobile. We're Apple. And because Apple, starting back with that initial iPod, when Commander Taco of Slashdot fame said no wireless, less space than a Nomad, lame, and that the karma was set, and that Apple was going to dominate MP3 players, and they've managed to continue the brand extension story centered around Apple as the brand, mobile Apple in particular as the brand, and be able to just convince their legions of followers to continue adopting the new product segment. The Kindle Fire is a Kindle. They chose the name with that in mind, that they're just extending the concept of a Kindle. It's still an e-reader. You're still going in and buying books from Amazon. You can do other things with it too, and that. But at the end of the day, it's still a Kindle. They sold a fair number of Kindles, and they are believing that they are going to be able to convert some of those into people using the Kindle Fire, plus, of course, adopt new ones. Pretty much everybody else, though, I mean, it is, it's a little bit more crickets chirping in that in terms of these sorts of stories. I find too many of the other manufacturers are focusing on features, functions. We are smaller, faster, bigger, lighter, brighter, whatever, which is cool. And those sorts of arguments will work great 5 years from now. Right now, those sorts of arguments are not going to be what's going to convince a consumer to feel they need a tablet. Apple and Amazon have easier stories. We, of course, are hoping that Amazon will continue using Android, and that there, the rumors floating around last week that they're interested in acquiring WebOS from HP, and that we'll see where all that leads. Prediction number 4. In 3 years' time, we'll have a much better established pecking order for app distribution. Right now, there's Snow White, the Android market, and seemingly the 7 million dwarves. Those of you with apps, you know about the 7 million dwarves. You get emails from them a lot. Hi, I'm such-and-so from whateverit.com, and that we'd love to have your app on our market. Lots of these floating around. Some might win, some might not so win. And that. Now, personally, those of you who've been following me, I have been begging people to support alternative markets from the beginning, to establish competition for the Android market, simply to make sure that Google keeps up after the Android market, continues improving it, advancing it, and so on. Anyway, by 2014, and that this whole situation that should become much clearer. There should be less questions in your minds as developers on where you're going to want to try to get your app distributed. Users are going to think about their primary market first and foremost. This is the market that in their minds is where they usually get their apps from. For a lot of them, of course, that's going to be the Android market. The Android market isn't going to dry up and blow away like a tumbleweed between now and 2014. There are going to be, however, additional markets of importance for segments of users who've chosen a device that, for whatever reason, is not running the Android market. Amazon App Store for the Kindle Fire and subsequent generations. Barnes & Noble Nook, if they're able to make a go of it, and Kindle Fire is definitely going to make that a challenge. They don't use the Android market. You have to distribute separately for them. BlackBerry with the Playbook and subsequent generations, you won't be using the Android market necessarily. You might be using their own market technology. You as developers will choose which ones of these manufacturers you want to support based upon availability of hardware and the nature of that particular market. I've heard plenty of stories of Nook developers who are doing really well because there's just not that much competition right now. And particularly for devices like the Kindle Fire and the Barnes & Noble Nook, the people who buy those devices are expecting to be continuing to pay. They're initially thinking books. It's a short jump from books to buying books on the device to buying apps on the device. And so it is sometimes better to be a big fish in the small ponds in addition to being the small fish in the gargantuan ocean that is the Android market. Enterprise markets will continue to grow in importance, not for ordinary consumers, but for enterprises. Cisco with the AppHQ technology, if they get that so that it's not only on Cisco-branded hardware, but available for the rest of the devices in an enterprise's fleet, that sort of system, and that is prime for being able to go in and be considered a primary market great opportunities for app developers with more business, enterprise-focused apps to be able to go in, do bulk licensing deals for bulk money, and that we like bulk money, 99 pence and that per app, and that takes a long time to get rich. On the other hand, things that are going to tend to fade out. Some carriers were establishing markets. They thought they wanted to have their piece of the pie before realizing that, if the users don't care about their market, it doesn't matter whether they are making 10, 20, or 30% off of the sales through that market. They will wind up turning those more into simply a promotional channel, and that to try to augment the notions of the built-in apps and firmware that they are continuing with today. More the handset manufacturers, the ones who have an Android market, some of them were creating their own markets as well, and that oftentimes is kind of an end around beyond places where the Android market itself wasn't going yet, particularly with paid apps. So Motorola with Shop for Apps, designed to be able to get into places like China where Google hasn't been going. We'll see where Shop for Apps winds up here given the Google acquisition of Motorola earlier in the year. And then there's the rest of the 7 million dwarves, and that most of those will either find some niche audience, part of the not-so-lighthearted piracy, not going to be gone by 2014. Sorry if this breaks your heart. And then so the markets that are specializing in pirated apps, they're still going to be around. They'll have their niche audiences and so forth. But most of them are going to fade into the background. Prediction number 5, in 3 years' time, modded ROMs will be significantly more popular than they are today, though not necessarily for positive reasons. Some people might think that I'm anti-mod. I don't run a modded ROM, and I notably had a blog post, and that during the Cyanogate catastrophe, and that where I was taking to task various fans of CyanogenMod who were, spamming the comments in the Android market for apps like the ADC2 application, and that, free Cyanogen, saying that that wasn't necessarily the best way of going about trying to make sure that Cyanogen would have a bright future. In truth, half the reason why I'm here is because this is possible. It's because the modded ROMs are a way that we can go. We can take advantage of the open source nature of Android to create our own Android distros. There are a number of positive reasons why modded ROMs will climb in importance and popularity in the next 3 years. Increasing signs of device manufacturer support. Sony Ericsson making very positive noises towards the modding community. Other manufacturers saying we're going to stop with the bootloader locking stuff to allow you to be able to run modded ROMs much more easily. Somebody, maybe several somebodies, are going to go after segments where modded ROMs are the right solution for creating purpose-driven devices, the e-readers of the next generation, and going after enterprises who decide that they don't necessarily want an operating system that's defined by a hardware manufacturer or defined by a carrier. They want the operating system to be defined by the enterprise based off of Android, but with the particular security characteristics that they want to have baked in. And there's going to be an increased importance in ROMs aimed for freedom. Try to make sure that these ROMs don't have anything in them that's going to compromise the safety and security of the people who hold those devices. Prosusvalence and that, quis custodia ipsos custodes, who watches the watchman. And for any native Latin speakers out there, I'm sorry for massacring that. And that making sure that we're going to be able to keep tabs on what everybody else with the cameras is keeping tabs on. This is why projects like the Guardian project with Orbot and so on, and that are such important today. That sort of stuff is going to move into the modded ROMs so that people will be able to get devices on their hip or in their pocket where they know what's on that device, they know what that device is communicating with, they know whether or not that device is going to cause them a problem. On the flip side, though, there's going to be increased interest in these ROMs for reasons that are not quite so positive. Malware is going to continue to climb in Android. We're going to want to consider ROM-based defenses for this. Cyanogen already has some stuff in there to help with permission creep, where you're going to be able to go in and say, yeah, all right, the install process said I had to give the internet permission to this app. I don't know why this app needs internet permission. I'm going to revoke that, and we'll feed back information to make it seem like, you know, we're on airplane mode or something at this point in time, so that apps that keep asking for more and more and more permissions can be curtailed. Tap jacking. And that the downside of all those little apps you can get that can float over your dial or the in-call screen or float over the home screen that you can tap on is that they can intercept anything they want to. You can have transparent overlays on top of Windows that can intercept all touch events, which in some cases means they can intercept all soft keyboard events. They can take that information, mash it up with what activity is running underneath, use that in order to be able to steal passwords and so forth. Our defenses as app developers against this is modest at best. And so these sorts of things are going to become more of a problem, and that people are going to start turning to alternative ROMs in order to be able to have a device where they feel they're not at risk. And the devices, unfortunately, seem to be shipping more with what many of us would consider to be spyware, that they're going to have applications on there that are not necessarily in our best interest as the owners of the device. From a public standpoint, perhaps the biggest incidence of that, fortunately, hasn't been with Android. It was in 2009, where all the BlackBerries in the United Arab Emirates were installed with a keylogger, and that pushed over the air. And that we have no idea exactly where that data would have gone had the keylogger not been really poorly written. And that the Carrier IQ, multiple manufacturers are baking in Carrier IQ technology. Carrier IQ, their mission is to aggregate information about what you are doing with your device, sending that information out. They say it's anonymized. Yeah, but we've already seen that so-called anonymous data sets can sometimes become not so anonymous with some additional data leaks. And so modded ROMs, whether it's for positive or negative reasons, are going to become increasingly important over these next 3 years in order to deal with these issues. So those were 5 predictions. Yeah, I could go on and that, but I'm already running a couple minutes over time and so just here's a few more. Android's climbed the top of the mountain. Now Android's mission is to defend its territory, and that we're going to have storm clouds. You can see them already with all the patent suits. Microsoft, Apple, Oracle, Intellectual Ventures, the king of patent trolls, just filed suit against Motorola yesterday. So there's going to be continued issues. You're going to have times when you're going to question whether or not Android's the right answer. But there's still plenty of signs for optimism. This is mostly lighthearted set of predictions. So all I can ask you to do is keep coding, keep writing, keep selling, keep calm, and carry on. Was that line used?
Thanks a lot. I think